Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Kaoshiung Medical University for inviting me to participate in this important seminar. As you heard, in the next few minutes I will try and tell you a bit about our experience in Israel with the impact of the use of organs from executed prisoners in China on our new organ transplantation law and what were the results of this new law. So let's start with a story. My story starts back in 2005 when I was confronted one day by a patient of mine who has been hospitalized in my department of cardiac surgery for more than a year, waiting for a heart transplant on the top waiting list. And one day he comes to me and tells me, Professor Lavee, I'm fed up waiting for heart transplant for a donor to come by. And I was told, this is what he told me, by my insurance company, to go to China on a specific day, 3 weeks ahead of time, and to get a heart transplantation on this specific date. And I looked at him and I asked him, do you understand what you're telling me? Do you know what this means? This means if they tell you to come for a heart transplant on a specific day today, this means they know ahead of time that somebody is going to be killed. And he told me, I'm not going to ask any questions. This is what they told me. This is what I'm going to do. And indeed, the patient went into China and got the heart transplantation on the exact specific date that he was told ahead of time. Now, in order to understand the background for this patient's story, you have to understand the status of organ donation and transplantation in Israel. And you can see here by the 4 different organs, kidney, heart, liver, and lungs, in orange, the number of candidates each year, and in green, at the bottom, the number of actual transplants performed from deceased donor, and in blue, where appropriate, the number of living donors. And you can appreciate the large discrepancy between the number of candidates waiting for the organ transplant and the actual number of transplants performed. Shown otherwise, the gruesome problem, or the problematic problem of donor situation in Israel, at least until previous year, you see here the number of donors, deceased organ donors, per million population, and Israel is right here on the right-hand border with 8 donors per million population, and you compare these numbers to the various European countries, to the United States, to Australia, to Canada, and you can see here the 8 million of donors per million that we in Israel have compared to all other countries. So, in order to understand the causes of the low organ donation rate, one of the major causes of the low organ donation rate has always been the generous reimbursement of transplant tourism by the various Israeli insurance company and sick funds, who have always fully reimbursed all transplant operations performed by any Israelis who went abroad to any country, regardless of the legality of this operation. Up to the year 2008, China has always been the main venue for most Israeli patients to seek for organ transplant. Now, for years I've heard the stories from my colleague, the kidney transplant physician, who told me that many Israelis, hundreds of Israelis, used to go to China and get a kidney over there. Now, as I am a cardiac surgeon, a cardiac transplant surgeon, I never bothered to make a research about it, as it was my assumption that these patients are going to China in order to buy one kidney for a poor Chinese person who would sell one of his kidneys to improve the economic status of his family. Not that this is legal, but this is what I thought. Now, the case that I just told you of my patient, this was the first Israeli patient ever who went to China to get a heart. And moreover, he got it on a pre-specific date. Now, this made me curious and made me starting to do research. Now, it didn't take me too long to find out the gruesome details of the abhorrent Chinese practice since the 1980s, whereby the source of most of transplant organs are prisoners sentenced to death or prisoners of conscience whose consent is either non-existent or ethically invalid, and whose demise might be timed for the convenience of the waiting recipient and their sale to anyone who can afford the price. Now, when I started to do the research, this was back in 2005, the official status of the Chinese regime was to deny this process, And the only evidence that we had at that time was that of Dr. Wang Guoqi, who was a former doctor at the Police Tianjin General Brigade Hospital, who fled to the US, and in June 2001 made a testimony in front of the Subcommittee of International Operations and Human Rights of the Committee of International Relations in the House of Representatives in Washington. And in this testimony, he gave full details of the gruesome process of organ harvesting of executed prisoners, sometimes even before they were fully dead. Now, when I started to make the research, this was back in December or October 2005, the Chinese Vice Minister of Health, Dr. Jifu Wang, for the first time admitted in writing in this paper in Liver Transplantation that apart from a small portion of trafficked victims, this is what he wrote, most of cadaveric organs come from executed prisoners. Although he claimed, it should be clarified, that at the present, the only prisoners who are subject to capital punishment in the PRC are convicted criminals, and in addition, the relevant governmental authorities require that the prisoners or their family provide informed consent for the donation of organs after execution, although this habit was totally rejected by all international organizations dealing with transplants. So I have published the first publication, the result of my research, in the Israeli Medical Association Journal in a paper which was entitled, this is in Hebrew, and the English translation is Procuring Organ for Transplant from Death Row Prisoners in China. But most importantly, I have added a call to the Israeli authorities to stop completely the reimbursement of those Israeli patients, as I found out that out of all patients who came to China, transplant tourists who came to China, the Israelis were probably the only one who were fully reimbursed for their operation by the Israeli insurance company and sick funds, and this reimbursement provided a sort of a de facto agreement or acknowledging about the legality or the ethically legal way of the organs that were harvested in China. So in July, this was already after I had published my first paper, on July 2006, as you have heard before, the two Canadians, David Matis, the lawyer, and David Kilgore, the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs for Eastern Asia Affairs, have published their bloody harvest report, which for the first time described the use of organs from Falun Gong practitioners in China as the major source for organ transplantation. So based on this report, I published another paper in another Israeli medical journal, and this time it was termed Shooting and Cutting, and in it I detailed all the details about the findings of Kilgore and Matis in their bloody harvest report. Next, it took the Israeli media some time before they picked up this story. At the beginning, with only short articles like this one, where the title says, "Doctors transplant in China are crime against humanity," and a short article like this one, saying that 250 Israelis sought organ transplant in China over the past 2 years. And I've already started to feel like, a bit like Don Quixote trying to fight the windmills. But as I'm myself a son of survivor of the Nazi concentration camp in Poland, I told myself that, especially as an Israeli, I could not continue this ostrich behavior and bury my head in the sand and know that something wrong is being done anywhere in the world and not tell the world about it, similar to what has been done with my people. And therefore, with the aid of one of my friends who is a famous journalist in Israel, made sure that Israel's most famous newspaper has published this huge expose story, which they call "They Do Not Have a Heart, Organs Trade Made in China," in which all the details which I've previously published in the medical journal have been published in this paper. And following this particular presentation, which was very well publicized, and in another op-ed article which I wrote in another, the most famous news portal in Israel, and this was called Jewish Heart in China, finally our parliament, which is called the Knesset, has convened and on March 31st, 2008, legislated the Israeli organ transplant law. Now, the Israeli law defines specifically what organ trade is all about. And he says, first, that the person should never receive any compensation in exchange for an organ which has been procured or is planned to be procured from his or another person's body. So, first of all, should not receive any money. B, a person should not give any compensation in exchange for an organ which has been transplanted or is planned to be transplanted in his or another person's body. But most importantly, the law states that the person should not act directly or indirectly as a middleman, as a broker, between an organ donor and an organ recipient. Because this is the main target of the law, to stop totally the phenomenon of organ brokerage, which has been very abundant in Israel. The law further states the person who performs any of the above will be sentenced to 3 years in jail, plus he will be fined in a large fine. And most importantly, the law states that all the clauses which I've just mentioned above apply whether the organ procurement and transplantation has been performed within Israel or outside Israel, which means the law includes organ trade as, or defines it as illegal, both if it is performed within the borders of Israel and anywhere outside in the world. And lastly, the law said that under this law, the performance of organ transplantation in a country outside Israel, including reimbursement of such operation, is possible as long as both of the following are maintained. One, the procurement of the organ and its transplantation has been performed according to the law in that country, but most importantly, the orders against organ trade, as stipulated in the Israeli law, are kept. This particular clause has brought reimbursing of illegal transplant operation to a complete halt, because immediately following the law, rules have been made and orders have been given to all Israeli medical insurance companies, both private and national, to immediately stop or banning reimbursement and stop reimbursement of transplant operations performed anywhere in the world, which meant mainly to China, because China was the main venue, as I told you. And therefore, since 2008, not a single Israeli patient went anymore to China, not for a kidney, not for a heart, not for liver, not for any other organ. And shown otherwise, if you see the total number of kidney transplantations performed on Israeli patients abroad, anywhere in the world, so from a peak of 155 cases in the year 2006, look at this here, the previous year, the number had dwindled down to 35 cases alone, and these 35 cases were done in the United States, in the UK, in Western Europe. These are legal, totally legal cases. So totally stopping of all transplant tourism from Israel to China by banning reimbursement of these operations. However, when I suggested to our parliament and made sure that the doors to China will be locked and closed, and they were locked, I felt immediately the need, while closing the door, to open the window for all these poor patients who are waiting desperately to receive an organ transplant, because you cannot just close the door and let the patient, hang, so to speak, in the air and not provide them some solution. So the second cause of the low organ donation rate in Israel is what we in Israel and also outside in Israel term as the free riding phenomenon. Now, what is the free riding phenomenon? The free riding phenomenon is a phenomenon of candidates who are waiting to be transplanted, but at the same time, because of religious belief, because of you name it, do not believe in brain death and are not willing to participate in organ donation in such case. Now, this fact that you are waiting for your life to be saved by organ donation, yet you are not willing to donate in the same manner, created a lot of antagonism among the Israeli public, and has repeatedly been cited in public surveys as one of the major reasons there was a low organ donation rate in Israel. And the most famous case was a patient of mine, again, who has been waiting in my department for a long time for heart transplantation. He was religious, and he told me one day very frankly, Professor Lavee, although I'm waiting here in your department to be saved, so my life will be saved by heart transplantation, I must confess, he told me, that if the case was reversed, and I would have been asked to give my permission for donation of a relative of mine who has died, brain death, and I would have been asked to give my permission for organ donation, I could not give you this permission. And I told myself, this cannot continue. If a patient wants to be saved by organ donation after death, he has at least to agree to become an organ donor in case such a case develops. So based on this, I came to the Israel National Transplant Center with a proposal that candidates for organ transplantation who have been registered as organ donors for at least 3 years prior to being listed will be prioritized during organ allocation. Obviously, the 3 years period, I put it in because it doesn't make any sense for a patient to know that he needs a transplant to go to the other door and be registered as a donor in order to be prioritized. So at least 3 years before that, if he has been registered as donor, he will be prioritized during organ allocation. There is no country in the world that has applied or legislated such a law before. This proposal, which, as you'll see in a minute, became a law in Israel, both incentivizes the potential donation, as well as penalizes the free riding. So, together with the members of our parliament, we have included a special clause in the organ transplantation law, which provides priority to organ and during organ allocation of 3 categories. Top priority will be granted to candidates whose first-degree relative actually donated an organ after death, or have been themselves live kidney or live liver lobe donors. The second priority, as I've already mentioned, will be granted to those candidates who have been registered as organ donors at least 3 years before they have been listed. And finally, third priority will be given, and this is the lowest priority, to candidates who are not registered themselves, but their first-degree relative has been registered as organ donors. So based on these 3 categories here on the left, top priority, middle priority, and the least priority, for each and every one of the transplanted organ, a scoring system, a very complicated scoring system, has been devised, whereby these points will be added to the points given by the medical status of each candidate. I will not go into details, but believe me, it works. we have published this work at The Lancet, and immediately following this publication, the world news media have picked it up, this new and unique organ transplantation law, with a lot of interest shown by the BBC here, by the New York Times, as you can see here, continuing in Germany, in the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, continuing in the Wall Street Journal, down there in Australia and New Zealand, and finally in South America. All of them said that it should be interesting to watch what will be the results of the implementation of this priority law, and based on the results, they will consider maybe adopting it all or part of this new law in their countries. So, in order for the law to be effective, the Israel Transplant National Center has launched in the previous year a huge multimedia public awareness campaign, which started obviously in the internet with a slogan saying, "Sign the donor card and be prioritized in the transplant waiting list," in all major Israeli websites, continued in huge billboards along all major roads in Israel, again saying, "Sign and be prioritized in transplant waiting list," continuing in boards and huge ads like this on public transportation, continuing in a vast TV campaign. I won't run the movies, a short clip here, but the anchorman, who is an Israel national or most known news anchorman, is saying, "Waiting in line is sometimes a matter of life. Sign the donor card and be prioritized in the waiting list for transplant." And finally, another way that we advertise it, this is Israel President, Mr. Shimon Peres, who invited families of donors to his home. Everyone here is holding the donor card in his hand, and this is again very well publicized. So, let's see what were the results of the first year after implementing the law. Look here at the year 2011, the number of new registered donors in this year, but most importantly, look here, the consent rate for actual organ donation after death. If it was in 2010, it was 49% of the family of brain dead donors who gave permission. Within 1 year, we've jumped to 55%. 6% in 1 year is something unique, you don't get it very easily. As a result, the number of deceased organ donors has risen from 60 in the year 2010 to 89 in the year 2011. The donation rate per million population, as you've seen before on the map, on the world map, has increased from 7.8 to 11.4. And finally, the total number of deceased organs from deceased donors has risen from 157 to 267. All these will be published next month in the American Journal of Transplantation. But to finish this was not enough. I felt that something has to be done also in order to increase live organ donation, mainly of kidneys, but also of liver lobes. And the main reason live organ donation was not highly utilized in Israel was because of various disincentives that existed before the law, which we made sure with the law, and you'll see the list in a minute, that removed all these disincentives and made live donation much more appealing to the general population. So I'll go very quickly. If people want to ask me later, I can go into details. But these disincentives, which were removed by the law, were first, the law provides earning loss reimbursement of 40 days based on the donor's average income during the last 3 months before donation for the donors. The donor gets, from now, a fixed sum transportation reimbursement to cover all commuting to and from the hospital to him and his relative for the entire hospitalization and follow-up period. He gets reimbursement of 7 days of recovery in a special recuperation facility following the donation, within 3 months after the donation. He gets 5 years reimbursement of medical, work capability loss, and life insurance. And finally, he is being reimbursed for 5 psychological consultation and treatment. And before anybody asks a question, if you add up the amount of money for all this reimbursement, based on the Israeli economy, they do not provide an incentive by itself to donate an organ. So this is only refunding an actual cost that the donor has, but the refunding by itself does not provide incentive for actual organ donation. And look at this, based on this, the number of live kidney donation within 1 year has jumped from 7 to 1 to 117 as a result. So, to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, the implementation of the new organ transplant law in Israel has resulted, as you have seen, in a significant increase in organ transplantation, both from deceased and from living donors. First, by significantly decreasing transplant tourism by banning its reimbursement, you've seen that. Second, by prioritizing holders of the donor cards, registered donors. And finally, by removing disincentives for live organ donation. And with this, I thank you for your kind attention with this nice picture of my city, Tel Aviv. Thank you very much.